Hi, my name is Kristen Hayashi. I'm the Director of Collections Management and Access and a curator at the Japanese American National Museum. Constructed in 1999, the climate-controlled storage facility at the Japanese American National Museum is 2 floors, totaling 7,200 square feet, and it houses the largest collection of Japanese American material culture and archives in the world. JANM's collection spans from early immigration to the present, but the World War II experience really is one of our strengths, including several iconic collections related to Amache. So I'd now like to introduce you to the Muto, Origami, and Sakamoto-Sasano collections. The Origami collection came to JANM in 2003 from Robert Origami. The collection includes Troop 64 out of Los Angeles, their Boy Scout drum that was used by the Drum and Bugle Corps. This is a pre-war drum that the troop used. Min Tonai tells a story about his troop leader, who was Bob Origami's father, and how he was very adamant that the scout troop needed to bring their drums and bugles with them to Santa Anita and later to Amache. As you see the photo of the drum, you see 2 US flags sort of crisscrossed at the center of the drum, but that's actually not the original design. So I'll let Bob tell you the story himself about how that design came to be.
Originally, Troop 64 was a Japanese American Boy Scout troop, and therefore when they organized the drum and bugle, the flags were crossed flags, one American, United States, and one Japan with a meatball. Now we go a little bit fast forward, we get thrown into Santa Anita, and there's war going on. My dad said, we can't have that meatball. And so he had the art department erase out the meatball and draw in the American flag. So if you really look close, you can see a round outline where the Japan flag used to be.
Well, people might know about the drum, the Boy Scout drum, which has been on display at JAM for a very long time. We also have a scrapbook that Bob Origami kept of all the scouting activities. And the scrapbook is pretty incredible because it covers scouting activities pre-war, during World War II at Amache, and then in post-war. It also includes mementos from scouting activities during World War II. So there was an Amache patch that you see there, photos of the scout troop and the Drum and Bugle Corps at Amache. And then it also includes photos of Tim Origami, Bob's son, in the late 60s, early 70s as a Cub Scout. Together, the scrapbook and drum, which represent the continuation of scouting behind barbed wire in one of America's concentration camps, shows loyalty and patriotism to the US that many of the incarcerees felt they needed to prove. It's even more poignant when you think about the great lengths that these scouts went to demonstrate their Americanness by removing the Japanese flag and replacing it with the US flag, especially at a time when their loyalty and patriotism were questioned by so many. The Jack Muto collection came to JANM in 2012. It consists of negatives and photographic prints that Jack Muto created at Amache. Pictured here, he was in his early 20s when he was incarcerated at Amache. And it was at Amache that he learned photography from his uncle. You could see through Jack's photography that he had a wide range of subject matter. He took photos confined photography of the time. Jack, through his photography, also gives a real And so while Jack's photographic prints give a real important sense of what Amache looked like, his story is also quite impressive, not only because he was brand new to photography, but because of the great lengths that he went to develop the photos that he took there. In an article titled The Underground Photographer of Amache on JANM's Discover Nikkei site, Gary Ono, who befriended Jack Murrow in recent years, details how Jack created a 3-foot by 6-foot underground darkroom 7 feet below his barracks, digging out space below his cot so he could develop his photographs. And although Jack Murrow was not a professional photographer, he captured his subject matter with an artistry that differs from some of the other documentary photography of the time.
I originally planned to just make the original donation to the museum, and I thought that was the end of it. I hadn't realized that there was a process that goes through the review, and you make a determination on whether to accept things in your collection or not. But after I had made the donation back in 2014, I thought that was the end of it. And when you called, maybe several months ago, I was very happy to hear that the materials had been accepted, but something you said in the interest in the way you looked at my family sort of triggered something during that conversation, because I never really had an intention of following up with all these materials that we have here. But when you had mentioned that you were touched by the story of these 3 women, I sat there and I thought the rest of the day in a little bit different light about how significant their lives had been, and really they were amazing 3 women.
I think what's notable about the Sakamoto-Sasano collection is that it chronicles the life experiences of 3 generations of women from the same family, from pre-war, during World War II, and after. There are some family photographs before the war, which are especially poignant when you think about how much their lives will change in just a few short years. A large portion of the collection pertains to Amache, capturing the experiences of Scott Yoshida's mother and aunt, Louise and Frances Sasano, who were 12 and 16 respectively, at the time when their family was forcibly removed from Southern California and eventually sent to Amache. The collection includes ephemera that Louise collected, including invitations to social events at Amache, dances, membership cards for different clubs and organizations, and admission tickets. And most of this material was printed at the Amache silkscreen shop. Louise was also quite an artist, and there's quite a bit of artwork from her in the collection, including this hand-drawn map of Amache. The map is sort of a combination of her imagination as well as reality of their situation in Amache. You see the different blocks, and you also see different landmarks that pertain to Amache, including reception hall, fire department, but also a little bit of the imaginary. It includes names like Altadena Avenue, the Rose Bowl, all of which were places back home. And Louise has also noted where her very best friends lived, which block and which barracks. Louise's older sister Frances, who was in high school at the time, was quite involved in activities at Amache. Through these activities, she often wrote and reflected on the collective experiences of her peers. But there's also an essay that she wrote for one of her Amache High School class assignments. The essay captures how Frances is processing her situation at Amache. And at first she expresses a lot of anger and questions why she's there. She states that she knows it isn't right to hate those who are responsible for detaining her first at Santa Anita and later at Amache, but wonders when she'll be able to forget those memories and be able to look forward and think towards a more hopeful future. She ends her essay by saying, "Why have I been thinking such evil thoughts? It's been like this since Santa Anita. I know it isn't right to hate. I don't want to. I know I don't want to, but it's still there inside. When will I be able to forget this past and build my thoughts on the future?" The night sky is so beautiful. Back home, the lights of the city dimmed all of the natural beauty of the skylights. It makes me feel good to look at them. When I look up and see all the beauty there is in this world, I almost forget the ugliness that signifies confinement, fences, searchlights, drab barracks, etc. I'll not look at those ugly things. I'll think of beautiful things. It won't always be like this. The war will end someday, and perhaps there won't be any more wars. We'll have a chance, all of us. The destiny of America is in our hands, too. I wonder if there could be a world, or even an America, without inequality of races. It won't be now, and maybe not for a long time, but maybe someday. It'll come sooner if everybody puts his heart into it.
Hello, my name is Nancy Ukai, and I'm Project Director for 50 Objects. We are a digital history project, and we explore the material history of the World War II Japanese-American concentration camps through 50 artifacts. Our project researches objects from museum and family collections, such as this handmade electric fan that the Saito family preserved from their incarceration at Rower in Arkansas. Today, I'll be talking about panels carved from scrap lumber at Amache. Our art director is David Izu, and he has made a short video about this story, which is number 21 in our series. So today we'll be looking at the plum and nightingale carvings that were made at Amache, and learn how one carved panel that was rescued from being sold at an auction in 2015 led to the emergence and a virtual reunion of 9. So this one on the left was collected by Alan Eaton in 1945 as the Amache camp was closing. And it was going to be sold at an auction in 2015, but because it wasn't, we could research it, and 8 more just like it, but as you can see, with also individual characteristics, emerged in the next 5 years, allowing us to think about the lives of the carvers and also the various techniques. Some of them have poems and definitely different stories of displacement, loss, and then after the war, different afterlives of both the carver and the carving. So this theme actually of a nightingale or a Japanese bush warbler in a blossoming plum tree was really popular in the camps. And on the left-hand side, you can see a brush painting that was made at Rower. It was used for a Red Cross brochure. And in the middle is a nightingale carved into a kobu, this natural wood form. And on the far right is actually the same theme made by Matsue Makishima, who was incarcerated at Gila River, Arizona, using fabric, textiles, and thread. And in Japan, this theme has been popular for centuries. It's been used in court poetry in the 9th century. And these examples here are more recent. The depiction on the left is by the woodblock artist Koitsu in 1940, and probably many of you recognize the karuta from the Hana game that also depicts this really traditional theme. So Alan Eaton was a collector and a folk art scholar working for the Sage Foundation in New York City. And in 1945, he decided he really wanted to collect various types of crafts that were being made in the camp. He went to Amache in the fall of 1945, we don't know the exact date, and he loved the carvings that he saw and talked about the Amache school of craftsmen and woodworkers. So he collected a carving with this theme, and it's on the left. He published it in a book that was published in 1952 called Beauty Behind Barbed Wire. And so this carving sort of gained some fame at that time. It reappeared in 2015 in the auction. We'll talk about that in a little minute. Alan Eaton was born in 1878 and he died in 1962, so really was the same age as the Issei immigrants in some ways. He talked about the fact that the carvers used handmade tools from discarded waste metal, and the top is a carving knife used by Toshiro Morita, an immigrant who came from Sebastopol, California, who was an apple farmer. And the tools below are from the collection of Henry Kaku from Amache. Carving was done in probably all the camps. Certainly making survival things like furniture was a necessity. But in addition, there were classes held at the various camps in what they call the education department. Just people had so much free time because, they were imprisoned. And this photograph is actually of the camp in Rower in Arkansas, but you can see here the plaques that they were carving, which are similar to what we saw in Amache. And in Amache, you would see these plaques on display in arts and crafts shows. And in this particular image, you can see, for example, Western or what Eaton called Occidental themes like an American flag or horses grazing in a pasture. And then there were other themes people were carving, like popular cartoon characters. But you can also see Japanese themes such as the carp swimming upstream, gourds, an eagle's nest, and bamboo. The WRA took a photograph of the very dedicated and gifted instructor of woodworking named Yutaka Suzuki. He was actually from the Los Angeles area, where he was he had a nursery and he was a gardener. But he was also a very talented woodworker, and for the entire time that he was at Amache, he appeared to be teaching. This photograph shows him in March 6, 1943 at one of the arts and crafts exhibitions, and he's teaching a student named M.Y. Murakami. Notice how Murakami is kind of scraping away wood from the design which has been traced on the slab. So in 2015, Eaton's collection of carvings and 450 other camp artifacts was to be scheduled for sale. And included in it was this pine and nightingale carving. You can see it in this advertisement on the left-hand side. Because of community outrage and a social media campaign and legal work by the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, the sale was suspended, and the entire collection of Eaton's ended up at the Japanese American National Museum. So that allowed research to be done on the very first one on the left-hand side, which is the carving that Eaton collected at Amache. And over the course of the next 5 years, 8 more carvings just like it came out of the woodwork, so to speak, in California, Colorado, Oregon, and Illinois. And so names of carvers were able to be found. In some cases, some of them were anonymous. Whoever carved it, that history had been lost. And in some cases, we could contact the families, get photographs, learn about the history of that person, and sort of understand that this was a community of carvers whose lives intersected at Amache during World War II because they had been taken from their homes and decided to choose this particular theme to carve under their teacher, Suzuki. The person on the left is Namie Hanamoto. She's actually in Chicago, and she did not carve it, but she was the building manager of a boarding house in Chicago, and her daughter, Karen Yamasaki, said that she believes her mother was given that carving by probably someone from Amache. Having so many carvings to look at is just really illuminating. So the one on the left was very interesting. It was given by someone to an immigrant at the Tule Lake camp. And so one wonders if this carver from Amache had been sent to Tule Lake Segregation Center because he didn't give the right quote unquote answers on the loyalty questionnaire. The blossoms are painted, it's not signed, and his name or her name has been lost to history. But there's another carving with painted blossoms in the same background confirmed to have made it Amache, so we believe that this has an Amache origin. The one on the middle, interestingly, doesn't have a bird, making us wonder if the person, was that an intentional decision? Had this person, Toshiro Morita from Sebastopol, made a mistake? And then the third one on the right-hand side is by Takano, Yasutaro Takano of Alameda, California, who was a Buddhist priest and was taken away from his home. Beautiful work in the background. These also are interesting examples, and I'd like you all to look at the poem, which is written in the same hand on all three carvings done by different people. The one on the left by Toshiro Morita, which was, his work was interrupted. The one in the middle by Jintaro Ando, who owned a laundry in Mill Valley, California. And the far right, which is done by Fujita. And according to research done by Dr. Leo Hanami, who is a retired professor from George Washington University in Georgetown, this poem was written by a Buddhist nun named Otagaki Rengetsu. And according to his interpretation, there's sort of a quiet support for the emperor. And please read our article to get more details. But if this is the case, it's quite interesting because this combination of a very traditional carving with this poem that is artistic code of resistance gives us a much deeper message. Clement Hanami, the Vice President of Exhibitions, Art Director and Artist at JANM, has done a really incredible job of traveling the Eaton objects all over the country. And when he was in Chicago, he met Karen Yamasaki, who is the daughter of Namie Hanamoto, who had been given this carving. And what's interesting is there is a medallion with a name, Yoshihisa, and the Fujita carving as well gave us a hint of who it was because he had kind of cleverly carved a knothole and then put his name in katakana in it. So just would like to end right now and say, if you have a plum and nightingale carving in your family collection, please do contact either 50 Objects or the Japanese American National Museum. I'll end with one more short video by David Izu.
Hello, welcome to the University of Denver Archaeology Lab. My name is Dr. Bonnie Clark and I lead the DU Amache project. And as a big part of our work that is dedicated to researching, interpreting, and preserving the physical history of Amache is that we've done 6 field seasons of archaeological research. A lot of that research involves what we call pedestrian survey, which is really just a fancy name for systematically walking back and forth across the site. And as we're doing so, we are looking for items that date to the period of Amache, which is most of the things that we find out there. It's a pretty isolated location, luckily. And what we understand is that is that the things that we find out there are often related to people's daily lives. And that's something that archaeology can really shine a light on. And so as we go through, we mostly record, document what we find, and we leave it in place. So we take pictures of it, we map it, but then we think it's best for the preservation of the site for it to stay where it belongs, where it was left at the end of camp. But we do collect a certain number of items that we think help shine a light on what was going on there, and whether having them means that we can include them in exhibits. And there is a exhibit that you can look at that's related to the Amache items that's on the resources page for today's programming. But then also items that we would learn more from by doing additional research. And then we also have items that are related to excavations, and we do some test excavations of incarceree created features, and doing those in-depth analyses that we can only do through archaeology when we uncover the soil that has blown in since the end of camp, and we can really start to understand some of the complexities of the activities that happened in these spaces. So I wanted to start off with two of our amazing items that we have discovered during our archaeological survey. And one of these, it doesn't look like much, really. It's not pretty, but it's just one of the hundreds of modified mess hall tin cans that we have found at Amache. And these really help to tell the story of the ingenuity and the way that people were super resourceful in camp. And so what this is just a big mess hall tin that has the addition of a wire handle. And then this is actually congealed tar and a little stick that would have been used to probably both stir and to apply the tar. And we sometimes find tar like this on the foundations. And so we believe that this was being used to repair those barracks buildings and to try to help keep some of that dust and snow from blowing in the gaps in those quickly built structures. Another item that we have that we actually found in the ball field where Obon was held every year is a gaita. So this is the, we believe, a wooden shoe. Then you can see here where the heel and the toe part would have been. It's only partial, it's a fragmentary one, but it is made out of plywood, which is not necessarily the wood that people choose to carve in, but it was what people had access to, and it would have made a very serviceable gaita. So the other things that are here, I wanted to highlight, again, both of those came from survey, but I wanted to also highlight the in-depth view that that excavation can give us, and what are the kinds of artifacts that we recover from excavations. And so I wanted to highlight the items that we recovered from the excavation of what we believe was the foundation of an ofuro, or a traditional Japanese bath. There are oral histories of these being used at Amache, and this rectangular foundation, each of these squares is 2 meters across, so that helps you think of how big this is. So it's about a 6 foot by 10 foot foundation, and it was made of cinder block as well as brick that was laid into concrete. And we wondered about the two different types of materials. And Gary Ono, who is an Amache incarceree, also helped us think through, as he was volunteering with us that summer and taking photographs, his experience on his family's farm was that one half of this was probably devoted to undressing and getting clean, and then the other half to actually supporting the tub. So that tub, which was filled with water, would have been quite heavy, but the other side wouldn't have needed to take nearly as much strain. And so when we did our excavations, which were centered in these two different areas, these blocks here, what we discovered really confirmed Gary's hypothesis and which was that in this area, we found materials that seemed to be related to the activities that would have happened as people were sitting in the tub. Whereas over here, we found things that were related to sort of dressing and undressing, as well as a kind of concentration of toiletries that I want to show you. And so, put this aside. So in the soaking part, we found things like this saucer, as well as the teacup that goes with it, or portions of it. Someone would have been sitting and enjoying that beverage while they were soaking. And also evidence of other types of beverages, like these are the caps from bottle caps that probably would have been from something like a soda bottle. So people sitting and drinking soda. They were engaging in things like putting in hair curlers and pinning them in with little pins. And maybe even just some, this is a melted comb. And the heat from the coal, this had dropped down into underneath, and this would have been burned up with the coal that was used to heat the water in the furo. And then in the other half, we found this amazing collection of toiletries that were wrapped, and we have just a few pieces that still exist. It was very fragmentary, but just like the wood, we find good preservation of organic materials at Amache because it's the high desert, and so things survive really well. So there was a black cloth that was wrapped around these, so we believe this would have been a furoshiki. So again, a group of toiletries wrapped in a cloth. And what's so interesting is that although they were wrapped in a traditional Japanese way, the toiletries were almost all pretty American-style cosmetics. So we have rouge that was in here and here. We have powder was in here. This is one of my favorites. It is the little top of it says runner stop. It was actually for keeping your silk stockings during a time of rationing from running. So it was some folks might remember doing this with fingernail polish, but this was specifically for keeping your silk stockings from running. We have perfume bottles and other toiletries. This was in fact had some wrapping for to be able to have like a bandage. Wrapping was around that. Again, some of the things that happened in the furo are in evidence. So we have a thimble here, so a little bit of mending maybe would have happened while people were sitting there. And one of the things of being able to bring these back to the lab and do additional analyses on them is that we were able to track down some of the information, for example, about the company that made these. But we also have an instrument that's called an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. That's a fancy name, but what the XRF helps us do is to be able to quickly and without, in a non-destructive manner, understand the composition of objects. And so we used that on both of these metal items, actually all three of these metal items from the Ofuro. And what they indicate is that all of them are very high in copper. So these were essentially different forms of brass. And copper is a rationed material during World War II. It's really important for the war effort. And so each one of these items would have been the kinds of things that people brought with them to camp because they would not have been available. And so we often, and we find similarly toys that are made of metals that would not have been available during the war. And so by having the close-up look that these objects help us have, we're able to tell that kind of richer story and to kind of envision, for example, first off, that we understand the different activities that happened in this furo, but a little picture of life of this bundle of items that some of which had been brought to camp, but then were left abandoned there as they went home. Perhaps we find that some of these, like the little rouge, we're careful not to open them up because we don't want to impact them. But like this one, we were able to gently open up, and most of the rouge is gone. It would have been the kind of thing that once the war was over, you could get new, and so they were left there. And it's a little sort of time capsule, if you will, and a great illustration, I hope, for all of you about the amazing preservation that happens out at Amache because of the high and dry conditions, the way that that sand that tormented Amachians also has served to protect the site, and why it is that we so carefully do our research. I also want to point out that we make sure that everything is curated to proper standards. So these are all archival materials, and they have all been part of student training, and they will be ready to go for the future when decisions get made about where the final resting home of all of these items will be. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Well, let's start with a small technical glitch. Sorry about that, everyone. So welcome to our panel about the stories behind the objects from Amache. And thank you guys for your wonderful videos about your research and about the collections that your institutions have. We are now open for questions. So everybody who's watching this live, please feel free to start sending in any questions you have for our three panelists about how you can care for your objects, about how we research and use the different artifacts and objects from Amache to tell these important stories. So I just want to start with a question of my own. So through the course of this weekend, our first virtual pilgrimage, we've had a lot of questions from people who have their own collections, their own family objects that tell them stories. What is the best way for people to share the stories of the objects that they have in their homes and are precious to them? And maybe, Kristen, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah, JANM's a very active collecting institution, and we're very fortunate to receive donation offers pretty consistently from a lot of individuals and families who have these treasures in their homes. I think it's, it really helps us to be able to anchor a story to objects. And so knowing details about, who created them or who owned them, I think is really important. So if there are relatives or family members, who can help to tell a rich story about an object, by all means, please document that story, because that makes the object even more valuable. But when it comes to, I think, preserving your family treasures at home, I think Dr. Clark did a really good job of talking about, how we preserve artifacts in collection storage. I think I always think that temperature and humidity and light levels are really important to monitor. So if you have your collections like in a really hot garage, but then in the winter it gets really cold, I think that fluctuation in temperature can be really hard on the artifacts. So our purpose is really to try to slow down degradation of materials as much as possible. So that's why Dr. Clark mentioned the archival materials. Those are, acid-free, and the intention is to try to, again, slow down any type of deterioration. A lot of these materials are meant to be ephemeral. So, again, it's all about documenting and trying to preserve the story that they tell. So.
Thanks, Kristen. Bonnie, there is a question for you here, actually. So we talked in the Moro collection, Kristen talked about the dark room that he established to help process many of his photos. Has the University of Denver done any work on some of these underground spaces at Amache and researching how people were doing things like taking photographs and processing them?
Well, I have to say we would, I had, once I found out about Jack's, so Jack Moreau and his underground dark room, we went and identified which one of his barracks. And unfortunately, there is a giant tree on top of his barrack. And so we don't want to disturb that. And so we decided that probably it was best to just let it as it is. And so we have not investigated that one in particular, but we have identified other underground and smaller sort of areas that people, I mean, one of the things about Amache is that most of the barracks floors were brick. And so people could pull that brick up and then dig underneath. And we have oral histories of people doing that, for example, to be able to have a cooler place to keep milk or dairy products if they had kids. And we have identified one of those in a barrack where it appears that they actually cut a round hole into the brick to set something down that basically so like a big gallon jug could be set down into the ground and kept cool. It could also have been maybe something like a crock for pickling as well. So we have found some of those, and we have seen others like little sort of almost like, again, coolers that have been actually with concrete that have been in there. But we have not actually been able to look at Mr. Moreau's dark room yet, but so maybe sometime in the future.
Wonderful. We have another audience question that maybe Nancy, in part of your research, you have found out, or Kristen and Bonnie might have elements too. For the art classes at Amache, do we know where the wood and tools were coming from, even the paper, sort of all of the materials that were being used to create these art objects?
In terms of, if I can just address that question about the wood, Alan Eaton in his books talked about wood coming from the fuel pile, and he implied that they were like logs because he talked about the fact that bark was on it and it was removed by many people, but some people who were very artistically inclined used the bark as part of the design. But if you look at the plaques themselves, they all have a pretty uniform size and depth. And Kuki Takeshita definitely said that her father carved his two carvings, one of a fish and one of the nightingale in the plum tree, on panels from citrus fruit crates. And so one wonders, and then we know that Fujita worked in the mess hall. So it seems like there might have been some sort of pipeline possibly, although this is speculation, between maybe the mess hall, the discarded fruit crates, and then the teachers. And Eaton also mentioned that he was at Amache, and people kept saying, oh, you must talk to Miss Hall about the carvings. And so he's looking for a Miss Hall. And then he realized, oh, the mess hall.
Mess hall.
And he went to the mess hall and saw a lot of carvings on display. And he mentioned Fujita's name, although he misspells it. So at any rate, it's a really interesting thing to think about, but we can't know for sure. In terms of the tools, clearly people were making their own. But in the WRA photograph of the instructor, Mr. Suzuki, he's holding what looks to be a commercial tool. And so by that time, maybe people were ordering them from catalogs.
First,
I'd like to just add to Nancy is that yeah, it does seem like so much of the art was made from just kind of cast off materials. But there is actually a really beautiful wooden carving at the Grenada Museum at the Amache Museum in Grenada that is from an actual tree. And it does have the bark at the back, and it's a beautiful piece. If anyone ever, if you're down there, to get a chance to see that. And we also see things, again, made out of old. So choya has a specific sort of shape, and so there's some things that are made out of basically choya skeletons, and then a lot from the roots of yucca that people dug up. And then Eaton talks about, and I'm certain that it was probably happening at Amache too, is that pulling wire out of the screen and using that wire to make the pins. And some of the things, like if the bird is sitting on something that's made out of wire, that some of that probably was scavenged out of the window screens.
Actually, if I can just plug, one of the 50 objects stories earlier was called the Amache dog carving. And that was carved out of a tree trunk. And it's an adorable carving of a puppy, literally kind of coming out of the wood at the Colorado Museum in Denver. So, yeah.
And I believe, too, with the fruit crates, a couple years ago, Sonoma State did a digitization project for a lot of Amache objects. And I believe one is a carving that on the backside still has some of the labeling from the fruit crate or from a crate.
Yeah.
So that might be another piece of this puzzle for all of us. So Nancy, with all of this collection of artifacts that are related, have you ever considered doing something like a family reunion and bringing together individuals who are making or have similar types of art held by their families?
I think that would be so awesome because 3 years ago, 5 years ago, there was one panel, that we were aware of and thinking about and looking at. And then over time, over 5 years, 9 have appeared. And so right now there's only a virtual reunion, and of course with Zoom, maybe you can get people on the screen together. Of course, to put them all together physically would be a wonderful thing. And maybe Janum, Kristen, can sponsor such a thing. That would be a dream. Of course, it should be done as soon as possible because the carvers have all passed away, and some of the children and daughter-in-law, in the case of Toshiro Morita, are able to tell us the story, but they're in their 80s and 90s now.
Wonderful. I think that sounds like our next pilgrimage will so the next 2 questions, Bonnie, I'm going to combine into one for you, which is asking about what kinds of technologies have we been utilizing to analyze Amache, like LiDAR and ground penetrating radar. And there's a related question about root cellars. So I think those two mesh really well. If you could talk to us about technology and root cellars.
Sure. So we have used ground penetrating radar to great effect at Amache, and it's partly because it's such sandy soil, and so it's well suited for using that technology. So just a little background: ground penetrating radar is it's like sonar, except it goes underneath the soil. And so it helps us be able to understand, for example, it helps us identify if something that we see just a little hint of on the surface is, for example, a buried garden, or it's also been super important for as, the sort of various developmental activities. So as the water tower got rebuilt, when the barracks were put back, we did ground penetrating radar to identify areas where there might be subsurface remains, and then we could go in and test them before they were disturbed. And so that's been a really important part of our research. And then another, we have not done specifically LiDAR per se, which is a type of laser scanning, but what we do have, and we'll actually be highlighting some of that imagery in the next panel on the power of place, is that we have beautiful high resolution drone photography that my colleague Jim Casey and an organization called SenseFly, they volunteered their time and technology to be able to do this. And so we've been able to create a very detailed elevational model using that, and just to capture this beautiful data, which we're now doing things like trying to use it to map all of the trees at Amache. So using them to both the trees that are standing, the trees that are falling, to understand what that treescape was like at Amache. So, and then and then the other, technology that I was talking about in terms of analyzing objects, which is the X-ray fluorescence. And that's been really useful, especially, like I said, for understanding the metal out of which things are made. And that helps us think about pathways to camp. And the root cellars. So there are really big root cellars that are off, like they are not part of the main barracks area. And they have been identified and documented on the surface, but we have not done any archaeological study of them. Though I know those have been really important. For example, at Heart Mountain, they're doing excavations in those root cellars. And so that's, that might be something that we do someday. So really, again, the ones, the sort of the little cellars we've looked at are, again, these things that people have dug within their own barracks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bonnie. The next question might be either Kristen or Nancy. With the bird pins, are they one of those artifacts that are art pieces that's made sort of universally across all of the different incarceration centers, or are there particular ones that are working on these? With JANM and its extensive collection, do you find certain art types that are sort of everybody is making them regardless of where you were incarcerated?
Yeah, we have a pretty extensive collection of bird pins. I've never really thought too much about, is every camp represented with these bird pins, but I can definitely say with certainty that there's several camps, if not all of them, that were producing bird pins. And I remember when I was at the Smithsonian, we were sort of looking, I think it was Audubon Society cards, but it seemed like that was sort of inspiration for a lot of these designs of bird pins. So again, I don't know with certainty if every camp, incarcerees at every camp were producing bird pins, but pins of a variety of types, including bird pins, seems pretty universal, I would say.
I think that the National Geographic article, there were apparently National Geographic articles that people were sharing. And so it's interesting to think about the transmission of images and ideas among different people in the camps. And one thing that really strikes me is the motif of a bird is so common in so many of the crafts, and embroidery, carving, textiles, and obviously flight, leaving. In the wood carvings at Amache, there are examples of eagles, peacocks, and then this nightingale alone. And so that symbolism is, I think, really poignant and powerful.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. I never considered the visual symbolism of some of these different crafts and the motifs that are represented. So we have a next audience question, probably for you, Kristen. Do you know when the Eaton collection is going to start traveling again, the traveling exhibit portion of that?
I know Clement Hanami is watching. Maybe he can put the answer in the comments, but I know he's also, he's creating an exhibition. I think, Nancy and Clement have done an incredible amount of research on the collection. They've taken the collection out to a variety of sites across the US and have collected these really amazing stories and connected families to these objects. And I know that the goal is to have an exhibition that really exhibits all this research and the collection again. So I know that is upcoming at JANM. And there were plans to travel the Eaton collection or to continue that, but COVID, I think, has sort of put that on pause. So hopefully Clement can answer if he knows what the plans are for the collection.
And just to pitch that
April, can I just mention one thing? Talking about the Eaton collection and how JANM has traveled it to expose it to so many people, I think really solidifies for us how the auction was stopped by the community's actions. And this research on the panels has been possible because of community cooperation, and Sonoma State's exhibition with Dana Ogoshu, Kirsten Leong's provision of a photograph, Bob Fuchigami calling up from the San Jose Museum and saying, hey, there's one of these panels in this museum. So all of this is a result of community collaboration. And I think we always have to remember that these panels were carved in community. And so I think that's part of that power that's communicated, maybe not written down, but we can't forget that.
Yeah, and I mean, this whole pilgrimage is a community effort. A lot of people came together and donated time and energy to do things like this panel. So that's a wonderful point. And to continue on the community theme, in the resources page for this session, there are links to the Eaton collection where you can see the contested history exhibit. And then there's also a link where you can see some of the objects that don't have provenience and help look through them to see if they're things that you recognize, photographs you recognize, and help jam them out. Use our community power here as Amachians to identify some of those things. So I recommend everybody go and check that out. I looked through it. It's wonderful. It's an amazing collection. And we're really lucky that Janum was able to acquire it and preserve it for the future. So yeah. Yes, Bonnie.
I just would like to put in a plug, and I'm about to put it in the comments, is that the University of Denver, we have a traveling exhibit of objects from Amache that come from the archaeological research, and so the exhibit can either go with just the panels that talk about the history, or if there's a place that people can have also the objects that go with it. It is a free exhibit. There's no cost except that people just need to cover the shipping. And so my university has kindly put together this. It's a very nice exhibit, and it's been all over. It's been up to Heart Mountain. We've had it at high schools. We've had it in like municipal libraries. So I've just put that into, I think, unfortunately I put it into the private chat, but maybe Kimiko can move it over into the comments so people can see that. So we'd love to, and with COVID, we haven't been traveling it much, but we would be happy to have it be out in the world again. So that's how you can get to the flyer about the exhibit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bonnie. That's a great pitch. And one of the institutions that's not represented in this panel, but there is information about in some of the earlier sections, is the Amache Museum in Grenada. And this is another place that has a lot of amazing community collections. And it's definitely community because it's run by the local community and run and supported by John Hopper and the high schoolers. So that's another great place for resources about Amache and about sort of the material culture. But we have another question that maybe Bonnie would be directed at you a little bit, although everyone's welcome to chip in here. So yesterday in the conversations, there was a lot of talk about the different elevations of the barracks and sort of the topography of Amache and how it slopes and you have to walk up a hill. But now, when you're out there, southeastern Colorado feels so flat. So maybe you could talk us through a little bit, sort of this change between a living place and an archaeological landscape or a historic landscape.
Well, it does seem really flat, and especially when you are coming in, if you come into the main road, it does, though, there's a sort of slight grade in elevation from as you move south. And so as you kind of come in the entrance, which is in the south, you're sort of heading slowly and gently uphill, but it is an area of kind of rolling sandy hills. And on the edges of camp is where it's sort of, it's sloped away. And so, and especially down on the western edge, which I believe the person who was talking about that was Kuki Takeshita, and she lived in one of the E blocks on 9E. And her block is actually, the topography is very tough. I mean, it's a pretty steep. And in fact, we have pictures that show that basically some of the people's barracks were almost underground and they had to have retaining walls and to drop down. And so the ground was not very well prepared. So there is, again, the overall topography might be a little bit, it looks like there's not much of it, but there actually was quite a bit. And that's, again, when Cookie talks about that block 9L was Beverly Hills, it wasn't just that most of them were from LA, but that it was on a high spot above the rest of the camp. And again, given that our subject today is sort of like, Amache objects, that does really impact. So, those areas of that changing topography is one of the reasons why in some places we don't really see the barracks foundations. But given what we know from our test excavations, that doesn't mean that things aren't down there, and that they're actually, again, that sand and the uneven terrain is in many cases protecting the living surface that was there when Amachians were there.
That's really fascinating. I was showing that map that Louise Sasano drew, and she references Beverly Hills, right? And I think Cookie is also on the map too. So it'd be great if we could analyze that map even further, and maybe you can help us to understand why things are named the way they are.
We would love to do that, and we could really. I can see April's always already itching. So we do digital mapping. Again, we're going to be talking a lot about that in our next session, but to take that map and kind of overlay it onto the actual camp geography is something that I bet we could get a student to do.
Or, a staff member might volunteer to do it.
That might just happen.
Just maybe. I loved the reference in there to the Rose Bowl. So in the center of Amache, there's a block that had a lot of the sports fields right by the high school. And there are amazing photos in the collections at the Amache Museum showing people gathered watching the sports games, both football and baseball, that were happening there. And so to see it being talked about as the Rose Bowl, right? It kind of tells you about the importance of some of these places at the site as locations for community to form. So we can, like Nancy's talking about, you can see it in the art, you can see it in the memorabilia that people kept, the reminders. So, yeah, Nancy.
I just wanted to mention that this reference to the Beverly Hills and the Rose Bowl is so funny and interesting and intriguing. And it made me think of the fact that the Issei in Japanese were giving kanji, assigning Chinese characters to their place names. So Amachi, the character is A for Asia, and Machi for town, which means Asian town or Asian community. And so it's interesting to think that depending on your generation, whether you came from rural Walnut Grove or urban LA with the zoot suits, you just really have a quite textured and a lot of little micro, social groups going on. And because we've been so accustomed to seeing this through the WRA photographs, it's a very homogenized kind of Nisei point of view. And I love these different kinds of details that are bubbling up.
Do you, and maybe this is a question for all of the panelists, do you think that the material collections at the different museums help show all of those different perspectives, right? Help represent the experiences of all of the generations of individuals who were incarcerated, and help tell sort of that incredible diversity of stories, so we don't have this monolithic perspective kind of created by the government.
If I can just pop in here for 1 second, I think they're all there, but the stories are buried, and particularly the Issei stories, because they're in Japanese. And so JANM has this incredible list of killed in action soldiers, but the names are in Japanese, or I guess they've transliterated it. And just in my own research on artifacts, because so many of the crafts were made by the Issei, the voice is just only apparent visually, but you don't really get the more nuanced history. And so to the extent that there are records and that they can be read and translated, in the case with these even panels, it's a little helpful. It can be a more rounded version, and that Issei immigrant voice can be brought out more to the surface.
Yeah, I think that, because the federal government was involved, right, there are all these records that really can help
I think, piece together a lot of statistics or details about the incarcerated population, which, for good or bad, I mean, I think that's helpful. But these collections, I think, really get to the humanity, right, of the people. And so with the Jack Murrow collection, he learns photography while he's at Amache. And he really he provides a snapshot, really, of just like a slice of life, and really, I think, shows you just the wide variety of people that were incarcerated there, from the very young to the very old, in a very poignant way. And again, the reason why I love the Sakamoto-Sasano collection is because it really tells the perspective of women, which I think is pretty unusual, especially the younger. I mean, these girls were in junior high school and high school, and to see, their perspective, I think, is interesting. And same thing with the Origami collection. I think it's both the Issei scout leader, but also, these young-ish Nisei boys too, and their experience. So I think this is giving a broader picture, I think, of the incarceration experience by showing, the experience of people of different ages coming from different places.
Yeah, I just would, echo what everyone else has said. And that's, again, one of the things about why, archaeology is, we think of it as a really interesting way to reflect a broad variety. Not everyone writes things down, but everybody makes trash. And so we're able to, we have evidence from, little kids all the way on up to, the elders in terms of the things that they used. And also, through things like the gardens, which were largely done by the Issei, is that we understand some of their strategies and their skills by looking closely at those remains. So yeah, I do think that they provide a really valuable and important balance to especially, again, the overwhelming sort of governmentality of so much of the record that we get from the camps.
Wonderful. So it looks like our questions are slowing down. So maybe we'll do a couple of kind of wrap up questions, give anyone a chance to send one last question in, but also give us a chance to take a quick break before the next virtual session. So I guess kind of one of the questions that I have and always am thinking about is, moving forward, as we think about the future of Amache as a place, as this really important piece of history, what do each of you see as the next steps in preserving and collecting these stories for your organizations and projects? Bonnie, do you want to start, and then we'll sort of move around? And
could you? I'm sorry, I was replying to something in the chat.
Okay,
I feel like one of my students. Could you repeat that?
Sure. I was sort of asking, what do you see as the next step for the University of Denver Amache project in continuing to work on preserving and telling these really important stories using our material collections?
Well, I'm really excited to be able, next year when we have our next field school, to work with John Hopper and the new collections that he's got, and also in this wonderful new building that they have. So to use, leverage the expertise in museum and heritage studies that I have in my graduate students and in my colleagues to kind of help do that. And I know that something that John has gotten a lot more of sort of paintings that are related to camp, and so to think about how to best display those and interpret those, and build some good storage. So that's something that I'm looking forward to. And I'm going to put in a plug-in for April's work. So April just completed her dissertation research on sort of social networks in camp, and especially thinking about sports. the way that sports bring people together. And so we're putting together a website that's going to be drawing from the archaeological remains, oral histories, site photographs, to really try to tell a very place-based story of the heritage of sport. So those are just, again, two things, and also just, getting back out to the site. I know April and I have missed it being out there, and so we're looking forward to continuing to go block by block and help tell those stories, like, the Beverly Hills and going up and down the hill in 9E. So.
Thank you. Nancy, do you want to go next and tell us what is the next step what's the next project for 50 objects?
Well, the next one will be published is, of course, on this Plum and Nightingale, and I'll share that with the Amache pilgrimage. But I would like to emphasize provenance, provenance, provenance. And the problem with the Eaton collection is there were no records. He just collected things, he stuck them in boxes, and we lost that connection between the people who donated them, or when he took them off barracks or took them out of camps. And so, to the extent that people listening, if they have an artifact, if they can gather as much information as possible while there's still some memory of it, whether you pick up your phone just very casually and not make a big deal out of it, but ask about it and write it down. And I think that's the whole thing, that if we can humanize and talk about the people behind these artifacts, that's history. And it's going to allow us to give more specificity and value to the story, rather than just having these things which people can project their own ideas onto. And one thing I'm really into now is people, if they can write their own family history. Now with self-publishing, I've gotten quite a little collection now of people's books, and they range from mimeograph manuscripts to more self-published books that are mostly picture books with captions, to nothing but text. But to the extent that people can capture that, and we're running out of time, it's really important, because future generations just won't know anything.
And I think that's a good point too. And telling the people in your life and your family why things are important, so that they don't get accidentally misplaced or the stories don't become disconnected from them. I think that's a very powerful point to make about keeping this all alive. And I think one of the things too to think about, projects like the Sonoma State Digitization Project. I know the Grenada Museum also, and the University of Denver, just photos. Even if you're not willing, your objects have your stories and they're part of your family history, but sending someone a photo and sharing that story, even using just imagery, photographs, scans, that is still a really powerful way of sharing your family's stories and connection with this history while keeping your family's possessions and mementos with you. So Kristen, what's sort of happening at JANM, and what is your next steps and thoughts?
Yeah, for the video that I created, so much of what I included in the video, I think, was me just parroting a lot of the research and storytelling that we've been able to document to date. But I agree with everything that Nancy and Bonnie have said. There's so much more information out there that I think we need to be able to document and research further. So I think, that being said, it's JANM's long-term goal to try to digitize as much of our collection as possible and make it accessible through our website, because, we're able to display such a small amount of our collection. And when we do that, we know that, connections are made and we learn more about the artifacts. So as an example, our education department created an educational activity around Louise Sasano's map. And one of Louise's friends, Leiko Miyahara, who, they hadn't seen each other for decades, saw that map and wanted to be reconnected with Louise. And so, I think these connections, as Nancy was sort of alluding to, are really important, and they help us to learn more about the artifacts. So it's our job to help facilitate that and make these connections happen. So we're going to try to digitize more of our collection and make it accessible online.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all for coming to this virtual session. Thank you to our panelists. This was wonderful and informative. We'll kind of wrap up now and give everybody a break. But the next session is the DU Amache project and talking about the power of place and how to find your barracks, both virtually and physically at the site. So please join us for that session. And thank you all for coming and for attending the pilgrimage and joining us in this virtual world.
Thank you. Thank you, April.
Yes, thanks, April.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.